The only way to get Putin to see sense and to be prepared to come to the table is to up the military pressure on him. He's not going to be persuaded by a few more tariffs or some more angry words in public. He's got to see that the trend of the war is no longer in his favor, which means more arms for Ukraine, more air defenses, more capacity to take the war into Russia. And when Putin understands that he can't outlast a combination of the Europeans and the Americans, and that therefore he better cut his losses and settle, then we will get a serious negotiation and we can perhaps get the fighting over and a ceasefire established.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today we're talking to Lord Peter Ricketts. Lord Ricketts has had a stellar career and is former British ambassador to France. That was, I think, between February 2012 and January 2016. Also non-resident ambassador to Monaco, and has been the British government's first national security advisor and a permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Commonwealth Office. You're head of HM Diplomatic Service, and you've got a little bit of experience in Southeast Asia. Is there anywhere in the world that you haven't had some experience? Lord Ricketts, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Well, things are getting interesting in Kyiv, are they not? And I think it's probably worth starting there, because we've seen significant anti-corruption protests, which are being billed by some as almost anti-Zelensky protests. When he submitted a draft law or signed a law through the Ukrainian parliament regarding the powers of the National Anti-Corrupt Bureau and the specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and then seems to have done a U-turn on it and has put another draft bill in front of Parliament that is giving all of its independent powers back again. What's been going on?
Well, what indeed? And it's perhaps worth starting by saying that anti-corruption is absolutely crucial for Ukraine's future. If Ukraine is going to join the European Union, if it's going to have hundreds of billions of dollars and euros of support, mostly from Europe and countries like the UK, it has got to show that the money will be well spent and that they've got on top of corruption, which has been rife in Ukraine for decades. And so this is a crucial area. And it seems to me to have been a huge misstep by Zelensky to basically neuter the two anti-corruption agencies, bring them under the prosecutor general, who was a placeman of his, at a time when some of the people in his circle were being investigated for corruption. I mean, that sounds like a terrible decision. And there was a predictable backlash against it in Ukraine, also from Ukraine's allies around the world. And I think, to do him credit, Zelensky got that and very quickly backtracked. So that's a good sign. He's obviously still listening, but it's a bad sign that he felt that he could take that step. And I guess we have to remember that now, 3.5 years into this grinding war, he's tired, he's exhausted. He's probably only now has a very small circle around him of people he listens to. And it's a dangerous moment because if he cuts himself off from good advice and from people who are prepared to disagree with him, then that's a very bad sign for the governance of Ukraine. So let's hope that he takes this as a wake-up call and thinks more carefully next time before taking steps to sort of protect those close to him without thinking about the wider consequences.
But in reality, Ukraine is a very junior democracy, and it's even more junior as a democracy not underpinned by corruption. Zelensky came in on an anti-corruption ticket, which means that all of his political growth in the past has been in an environment where corruption was rife in the political structure. So he's grown up with it. He will be tainted with it. Do you think naivety is what's come in? We went through the same, but ours was in the 14th century, I think, or further back before the days of the internet and Sky News and Times Radio and everything else, where it could be publicised out. Do you think it's naivety that's come in? Do you think people have got at him because of the anti-corruption investigations that are going on? What do you think's caused this?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly that he is in a position of kind of war leader, of not quite absolute power, but he's got very sweeping powers. And you've got to be very careful. They say that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He's got to be very careful to keep himself open to, as I say, people who disagree with him, other views he doesn't welcome, and doesn't regard everything that is going contrary to what he would like as somehow anti-Ukrainian, anti-patriotic and cracking down on it. because that is a way to disaster. He's got to keep himself available for advice which is unpalatable but is still right. So I think it's partly that. It's the isolating effect of power. Partly, as you say, the checks and balances are still weak in the country. It's got no tradition of uncorrupt changes of power, for example, transitions of power. They've still got an awful lot to learn, in other words, although in many ways they've hugely merited to find themselves members of the EU and NATO. They don't have anything like the background, even of the East European countries that have been out of the Soviet Union now for whatever it is, 40 years. And therefore, there's a great deal that they've got to do. And there's a great deal of help that we've all got to give Ukraine to get them to a better place in this, because otherwise it'll be disastrous for their own future. And I think Zelensky, in a part of his mind, understood that when he heard the reaction of countries that he depends crucially on. I mean, if he cuts himself off now from support from the major European countries or the Western countries, then he's in a real fix. So, I mean, let's hope that he has listened and he's learned. But it's a sign of how fragile things are in Kiev, which is, I guess, no great surprise. I mean, after what they've been through in the last 3.5 years is pretty unimaginable to any of us sitting in the west of Europe, and it's not surprising that their governance is showing some friction and some eroding around the edges. But let's hope we can keep it at that.
Yes, I'm surprised it's gone on as long as it has. But
in a way, that's true.
Does this not give a perfect opportunity for Moscow, because it's found a little crack and it can stick the proverbial knife in it and wiggle it to try and push the United States further away, manipulate Donald Trump, undermine Zelensky's position even further? Because that's been a line that they've been taking the whole way through, saying they want Zelensky out of the presidency. They want a new election, presumably so that the Russians can manipulate the outcome of the results.
Well, the Russians have been trying to undermine Zelensky since day one. I mean, you remember they tried to kill him in the early days of the invasion. And so there's nothing new about that. Yes, they are always probing for points of weakness, definitely. And Zelensky claims that the anti-corruption or the moves against the anti-corruption agencies were because he thought they were penetrated by Russians. I don't know, of course, whether that's true. So yes, they will try and take advantage of it. I think the Ukrainians are pretty resilient against all that. And of course, the Russian track record on corruption is terrible. But in many ways, I think Putin has played his hand disastrously badly since the arrival of Trump. And we can perhaps come on to talk about what's happened in the Trump-Putin former bromance, which it doesn't look very bromancy at the moment. And so you'd have thought that Putin would be agile and fleet-footed in capitalizing on errors like the one that Zelensky's made. But I mean, I think the evidence is that he's played an extremely bad tactical game with Trump. And I don't think that he's any more likely to be able to undermine Zelensky with the kind of tactics that they traditionally use.
Yes, I want to talk about Putin and Trump in a minute when we put it into context with the peace talks that supposedly happened in Istanbul. But before we get to that, one of the areas, and you mentioned it, is the relationship with Europe. And Europe relies on Ukraine moving down an anti-corruption stance to allow it to develop its potential membership of the EU and elsewhere. But at the same time, we're seeing a bit of a coming together between UK, France and Germany, with Starmer, Macron and Merz working more coherently to support Ukraine. What's your reading of this relationship?
I think it was a very significant outcome of the last few weeks and months, really. I mean, and the sequence where we had Macron on both a state visit and a summit, very close, obviously, to the king, very close relationship developing with Starmer. And then the following week, Starmer hosted Friedrich Merz for the first Anglo-German treaty of cooperation for decades. And Merz has emerged as, I think, a really strong pillar of European leadership on Ukraine. He's the one with the fiscal headroom, in other words, the capacity to borrow hundreds of billions of euros at low interest rates, because German debt is very low. It's the lowest of all the major countries in the EU. So here is somebody who really can ramp up his defense spending, his spending on support for Ukraine, and he's doing so in a way that Britain and France frankly can't, because we're already carrying huge debt levels and we don't want to see our interest rates spiking up. So the coming together of the three, Macron, who's got his 8 years of experience and all his sort of communication skills and charisma, Starmer, who's now got longevity in the UK system, he's still got a huge majority for the next 4 years, and the arrival of Merz, both with that and also with this financial firepower, that makes a pretty strong trio. And they are working very closely together. Of course, Macron and Starmer hosted a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing from the UK NATO headquarters at Northwood when he was here. And that whole Coalition of the Willing thing is really the emergence of a European pillar in NATO with France, Germany, and the UK at the head of it. And surprisingly, not much criticism from other NATO Europeans who basically don't like what tends to be called in Europe directoire, groups of countries that kind of take over the lead in Europe. But here they recognize, I think, the stakes are so high, the Trump risk is so real, that having the UK, France and Germany working together is a good thing. So all of that to say, that I think is a stabilizing factor in European support for Ukraine. But you're right to say that there are other European countries who are getting distinctly tired of having to fund Ukraine. The further away you go from the front line, by the time you get to Spain, there's not much appetite there for spending either on defense or on economic support. And then there are countries like, of course, Hungary and Slovakia, who are actively trying to undermine a European position. So any sign that Zelensky is not making real efforts to move in the direction of proper governance, being held to account, anti-corruption, all those kinds of things. I mean, that is an open door for those who want to argue that the EU should keep Ukraine at arm's length.
Well, it's interesting. You explain why Germany is taking very bold steps and moving some of its defense industrial base into Ukraine and cooperating with the Ukrainian defense industrial base and building up manufacturing capability there because it's got the money to do so. France has turned around and said it's not going to buy US weapons. It's going to spend its money on the French defense industrial base and buy from France, which France always does. And the UK is talking a lot. Am I reading the room correctly?
Well, I think you're reading the room correctly on that, because he really can ramp up defense spending in a big way. Of course, bear in mind that just spending the money doesn't give you capabilities. That takes years to come through, and it doesn't give you a defense culture, which Germany hasn't had really since certainly since the end of the Cold War, arguably since 1945. Whereas Britain and France do. I mean, our armed forces are used to going out and fighting and doing expeditionary campaigns, not always successful. So there's a military culture in France and Germany, but there isn't the money. And certainly Macron has demanded that his government find the money to do big increases in defence spending. His government is frankly hanging by a thread and might fall in the autumn over budget problems. And yes, they've never wanted to buy American equipment unless there was absolutely no alternative. And so they are pushing very strongly for European capabilities. And actually, I think both the Germans and also the British are interested in that as well, because everyone's watched how the US have switched off arms deliveries to Ukraine, maybe beginning to switch them on again, even switched off kind of weapon systems and said that you cannot use the HIMARS missiles that they got under Biden to attack Russia. So having American weapons in your inventory also means you're running a risk that if the Americans don't want you to use them, they'll find ways of stopping you or not supplying you spares or whatever. So there is a real push now to use European money to buy more European capabilities, ammunition, missiles, weapon systems. And I think the UK wants to be part of that. It's all part of the UK-EU reset that we've heard a lot about. Still not happened yet. Still texts have to be agreed. But that is the new direction. And I think Germany can provide a bit of a lead on that because they can spend more money more quickly. And provided we can get a good deal with Europe that allows Britain to come in on European-funded projects, with enough say, with enough influence, with enough capacity to shape, the new products that are going to come down the line, then we're going to get a real European armaments industry, rather than 3 or 4 different ones split across the continent.
Yes, I don't think people realize that buying weapons isn't like buying a car. You buy a car from a German manufacturer and you can drive it anywhere you want and you don't have to ask the manufacturer. Whereas if you buy weapon systems from outside your own country, then you have to ask that country's permission if it's not in the original purchase agreement, where you can use it and when you can use it and against what targets you can use it, which is why domestic defense industrial bases are so important. Is that something that you think as a country we need to realize more?
You're quite right. I mean, of course, if you buy weapons from others and you use them defensively to protect your own country, that's one thing. If you use them to go, attack another country or form part of a coalition, which is waging a war against another country, yes, you do. And in the case of American weapons, it appears that on their more advanced weapons, they can basically switch them off or, refuse to let you use them. I think even this F-35 fighter, which is now one of the backbones of the Royal Air Force, it depends totally on American software support to keep it going. So these are all factors that need to be borne into mind. Often American weapons can be cheaper because they can produce them by the thousand for their own domestic market. But it is time we had a European alternative to many of these weapons so that governments in the future can decide which they want. But as you say, this is a kind of something that people don't really realize, that you don't just go and buy off the shelf from America a missile system and then expect you can use it in all circumstances. That's not how they operate.
Little known fact that'll make you smile. The software that the Americans have control over, which controls the logistics for the F-35 fighter, I've read somewhere was actually written by a British company. So the Americans control it, but it's British coding. But you've got deep experience in coordinating policy across government. The UK and Germany came out with this 50-day drive to arm Ukraine. The title itself suggests this is a sop to Donald Trump's 50 days that he's given Vladimir Putin. Do you think that 50-day is being undermined by the anti-corruption protests? Can we put that to one side now? Do you think Putin is going to listen to what's coming out of Europe and out of Trump? And do you think at the end of the 50 days, anything's actually going to happen?
Well, I mean, of course, you can't rearm a country in 50 days. You probably can't even get a shipment of weapons from the UK to Ukraine across European borders in that time. You can make announcements, you can make commitments, and you can perhaps get some packages of weapons speeded up. So it's mostly a presentation. It's mostly the benefit of an announcement. As you say, there's a sort of parallel with Trump giving Putin 50 days. I do not think that the spat over the anti-corruption law, especially if it's rapidly overturned, as Zelensky seems to do now, will be a blocker on that. No, because we're playing a long game here to keep Ukraine going, to prevent Russia winning this war, to at least hold them to a kind of grinding draw and eventually get to some sort of ceasefire or armistice. And for that, we've got to supply a lot of weapons to Ukraine. So no, I think 50 days is just a kind of, a presentational device within that time to make some more big announcements about what will come in the next 1, 2, 3 years. But that's more relevant timescale to, for example, resupplying them with these Patriot missiles, which they desperately need. I mean, I don't think they're going to get many, if any, in 50 days, but they might get undertakings that more will be coming as soon as they can get them there.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And of course, this week we've had another set of talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul. No breakthrough. I think it lasted a record-breaking 34 minutes before each side stood up and went off. You've been a diplomat. What was the real purpose of the meeting? Is it trying to keep Donald Trump on side? I think they agreed another prisoner exchange of 1,200. That's not unusual. And the Ukrainians have proposed a leaders' meeting at some stage in August, which to my mind seems to be them wrestling the initiative and trying to force Putin's hand. What's your reading of it all?
I think the word that comes to my mind is performative. I mean, these talks clearly are not going anywhere. Russia and Ukraine sitting across the table are never going to agree, I don't think, without real pressure from outside, from China on Russia, from America on Ukraine. Not even the Europeans, I think, we're going to have much leverage. So, yes, I think both sides don't want to look as if they're the ones refusing to meet with one eye on Donald Trump. They don't have any prospect of reaching any agreement except these sort of tactical agreements, which of course have their value as well, of prisoner exchanges and so on. But this process is going nowhere as a negotiation over a ceasefire. I don't believe that Putin has the least interest in a ceasefire. He still thinks he can win by holding out, grinding down the West, grinding down European patience, killing as many Ukrainians as he can till they run out of further conscripts and recruits. So he is going to keep going. And that's where I come to what I was saying about spectacular mishandling of Trump. I mean, we all thought in the early days of Trump that Putin had him in his pocket. He seemed to be leaning over backwards to appease Putin, while being tough on Zelensky. Well, now we've got Trump sounding increasingly angry with Putin. He has nice conversations on the phone, and then Putin goes and fires the largest number of drones and missiles at Ukraine overnight ever. And he is getting impatient with him. And he's now, thank goodness, agreed to supply NATO with more of the Patriot batteries and so on, which they can then pass to Ukraine. So that's good. It just seems to me an extraordinary mishandling by Putin of a relationship that looked to be going in his direction. And now he's back in a at least Trump is neutral between the two, but he's no longer trying to help Putin to get to the negotiating table. I think he's lost confidence in Putin as wanting a deal, actually.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it was naive of us to believe that the Americans were going to continue to supply weapons at no cost to someone else? Given Lend-Lease during the Second World War, Trump seems to have just resurrected that and is now getting European NATO nations to pay for U.S. Arms supplies. At the end of the 50 days, do you think Trump will actually turn around and put secondary sanctions on different countries and live up to the threats that he's given? Or is he likely to extend it and potentially set the conditions just to walk away from something he has failed to solve?
I'm not sure I'm going to try and predict how Trump's going to jump on tariffs. I mean, history suggests it's completely impossible to predict it anyway. First of all, I think if a Democrat had won the election campaign in the US, then a high level of US support to Ukraine would have continued, because I think on the Democrat side of politics in the US, and some in the Republicans in Congress, they see that this is not just a war over Ukraine. It's a war that is really about who is going to dominate in Europe. Is NATO still capable of deterring a major adversary like Russia? And therefore there's more at stake, and therefore the Americans would stay involved. I think that would have been the Democrat president's approach. Obviously, with Trump, that's not going to be the case. In fact, he hasn't completely cut off Ukraine, which some feared. They still are providing intelligence. They are still providing some small packages of weapons. I saw recently a couple of packages worth $300 million, mostly of spares to keep existing things going, were shipped. So they are continuing at a lower level. But yes, major defense equipment now Trump expects to be paid for. I think he thought that the Americans were being ripped off, and therefore the deal is that the Europeans will buy the weapons, pass them on to the Ukrainians. That means the Europeans finding the money to do that, of course, but it does crucially still give Ukraine access to the advanced American air defense missiles in particular, which are so crucial to their defending their towns and cities. So it is certainly not as bad as it might have been. And I think if it had been a different outcome from the presidential election, then American policy would have stayed very much as it was.
So I've got you in a room with Donald Trump, with Keir Starmer, with Francois Macron, and with Chancellor Merz, and they turn around to you and say, okay, Istanbul seems to be dead. Are there any viable diplomatic avenues that we can start to look at? What sort of advice would you be giving them?
Well, I think I would have to say that the only way to get Putin to see sense and to be prepared to come to the table is to up the military pressure on him. He's not going to be persuaded by a few more tariffs or some more angry words in public. He's got to see that the trend of the war is no longer in his favor, which means more arms for Ukraine, more air defenses, more capacity to take the war into Russia. And when Putin understands that he can't outlast a combination of the Europeans and the Americans, and that therefore he better cut his losses and settle, then we will get a serious negotiation and we can perhaps get the fighting over and a ceasefire established. But it won't happen if Putin still feels that he has the advantage over Ukraine, that our Western support is fading and will fade further. So that's really the only solution. Sanctions, of course, have their role. More sanctions on things like the shadow fleet that is basically evading oil sanctions and continuing to flog Russian oil on the international market. Those help at the margins, but they're not going to change Putin's mind. He's in so deep now in this that it's going to have to be a pretty sharp and clear signal for him to accept that he's not going to get any further, and he'll have to settle and then explain to the Russian people how on earth losing 1 million men killed and wounded has been worthwhile.
But do you think the leaders in the West actually get this? And if they do, why are they not providing huge amounts more support to make it happen more quickly? Is it because we're embarrassed at the fact that whenever you scratch beneath the surface of what we say we have from a military capability and stocks and all the rest of it to the reality, it's embarrassing, and it's now taking time for us to build up that capability to properly give it to Ukraine?
Well, I think Merz, Macron and Starmer do get it, absolutely. Which is why they've agreed to these eye-watering increases in defence spending without really knowing quite where the money's going to come from in the case of the UK and France. So they do get it. Why aren't we sending massively more? Well, first of all, we haven't got massively more to send. After 3 years, I think our stockpiles are very low of critical weapons, and we can't completely neglect our own defence because who knows what Russia might do over the coming years. And so it's a question of how quickly we can produce weapons and get them to Ukraine. And that's about all these initiatives that are being taken in the EU and beyond the EU to ramp up the defence industrial production. Because on our own, we simply haven't got the supplies that could change the course of the war in Ukraine. And it may be that in 2 or 3 years we will have, but there's that awkward gap between what we can do now and what we may be able to do when German ammunition factories and British and French missile factories start churning out large numbers of weapons, which they are capable of doing, but the ramp up is more like a year or something than a month. So there is this gap in which we've just got to do everything we can. But I think they do get it. Trump doesn't get it, and I think Trump is looking to get out. He doesn't want American dollars being spent anymore. He doesn't understand really that Ukraine is the kind of last bulwark for the West. If it falls, then others may fall as well, and the whole global geopolitical picture will be different. He doesn't really understand that, doesn't accept that. He's more an isolationist. So yeah, that's changed. But in Europe, I think people got it late. Been very good if we'd started this ramp up 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. But of course, the big constraint is finding the money. And as we can see, the Starmer government have all kinds of problems finding the money for their top priorities, and finding a lot more money for defence is therefore politically very painful.
Yes, it's going to be interesting. But at the same time, from a wider geopolitical perspective, I think in the last 24 hours, I've seen unconfirmed reports coming out of Ukraine of drones that are completely Chinese manufactured being found inside Ukraine as part of the attack packages. But we had earlier in the week a senior Chinese diplomat talking to a senior European diplomat saying that China cannot let Russia lose. Do you think we're getting a greater global polarization, and how worried should we be?
I'm sure we are. I mean, there is a very, very sharp global polarization now. China can't see another authoritarian dictatorship fail completely in a massive war they've launched. No, I mean, that's not good for the brand of these kind of countries. Equally, I don't think they necessarily want Russia to score a massive victory either. Because they've also got a lot of equities in literally a lot of money invested in Europe. They do see the European countries as an important stabilizer between them and the Americans. So I think it suits them just fine for the Russians and the Ukrainians to be bogged down in a forever war, sucking funding and weapons and money out of Europe to support Ukraine, improving China's competitive position in the world. I'm afraid the status quo suits them rather well, and I don't think a decisive victory by either side does. So yeah, they clearly are supplying weapons. We need to use that to embarrass them because they claim not to be playing any part in actually supplying weapons to Russia, and so that needs to be exposed as clearly as possible publicly. But I think they will take that line to try to preserve something like a current balance rather than seeing the balance tilt dramatically one way or the other. Actually.
So, We're coming close to the end of our time, but given the diplomatic impasse that we're seeing, in Istanbul and elsewhere, but the coming together of Germany, France, and the UK, United States remaining on side for the moment. Domestic cohesion in Ukraine, it's probably going to recover, as you say, after a little speed bump, if we can call it that, with Zelensky's issue over the anti-corruption, his approach to anti-corruption. But what do you think the UK's number one strategic priority should be regarding the conflict over the next sort of 6 to 12 months? And do you think it's going to go on for longer than that?
Well, hang in there, I think, is the recipe. Keep going. Don't lose focus, even despite all the domestic political woes. I mean, yes, I think we have to assume that if we sit here this time next year, it will still be going on. But maybe if in another fighting season towards the end of next summer, there's still be no real progress by Russian forces and European supplies are ramping up, perhaps we are then getting to the point where Putin might be thinking, hang on, I've got to find an exit ramp from this. But I don't honestly see that happening in the next 12 months. And so we've got to use this new triangle of leadership, France, Germany, UK, to keep things stable, keep Trump as committed as possible, and continue to support Ukraine through this endless war they're in.
And how important do you think it is that as part of that, we grow our own defence capability as rapidly as possible?
Well, our own, but also in coordination with others. I mean, we need a better joint Europe-wide defence industrial capacity. There were words about that in the UK French and the UK German texts that were signed in the last couple of weeks. We have, I think, Europe's biggest defence industry here. It's getting more difficult to work with the Americans for some of the reasons that we've described. And therefore, I think a big drive to develop cross-Europe projects where the UK can play a major part, but we have other partners as well, given the scale we need to be operating at, the expense of modern weapons. And we can be a leader in that area, definitely.
So I think you've very clearly pointed to the global leaders, what they need to start doing in the future to deal with this. Lord Peter Ricketts, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to be with you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.